Marcus Thornwell had always considered his lake cabin a sanctuary, a place where the scent of pine mixed with the cool breeze rolling off the water, where the porch creaked under the weight of memories rather than problems, but that peace shattered the moment he pulled into the gravel drive and noticed the crisp, white envelope pinned aggressively to the weathered cedar door, flapping in the afternoon wind like a warning flag. He frowned, killing the engine of his pickup, stepping out into the sharp scent of gasoline and pine sap, his boots crunching against gravel as he tore the envelope loose, eyes narrowing as he unfolded the thick paper stamped with bold red ink. That screamed, "Notice of demolition, non-payment of HOA fees." For a moment, he stood frozen, his mind refusing to process what his eyes insisted was true. The sun catching on the embossed HOA letterhead, his reflection distorted in the glossy print as disbelief curdled into outrage. Non-payment? "I've owned this land free and clear for 20 years, he muttered, fingers trembling, scanning the text that accused him of owing nearly $15,000 in delinquent HOA fees, warning that if full payment wasn't made immediately, demolition crews would arrive within 24 hours to raise the non-compliant structure to rubble. His heart thundered in his chest, the taste of copper rising in his mouth, because he knew he had never signed onto any HOA, never agreed to their rules, never even attended one of their smug lakeside meetings. Yet here it was, in legalistic jargon, a death sentence for his cabin. He barely heard the crunch of footsteps until a syrupy voice slid across the porch like oil. "Afternoon. Mr. Thornwell, got my notice, I see," and Marcus turned sharply to find Karen Maddox, the HOA officer, standing prim and polished in a tailored red blazer despite the heat, her platinum blonde hair coiled into a rigid bun, oversized sunglasses perched like armor against accountability. In one manicured hand, she held a clipboard, in the other, a latte cup emblazoned with her initials in gold, her smirk cutting as she adjusted her pearl necklace and tapped the notice with a lacquered nail. "It's really nothing personal." "Marcus," she purred, though her tone dripped with satisfaction, "you've ignored repeated requests for payment, so the board voted unanimously to proceed rules are rules." Marcus clenched the letter in his fist, veins rising in his forearms as he stepped forward, voice low but shaking with restrained fury. "I've never missed a payment on anything in my life, and I sure as hell don't owe you people a dime. This cabin has nothing to do with your HOA deed, predates your entire subdivision." Karen's smirk widened, her sunglasses reflecting his angry face at him like a mocking mirror. "You'd be surprised what jurisdiction the association has, Marcus. Boundaries shift, covenants extend, and if you don't pay your fair share—" "Well," she glanced theatrically at the cabin, her lips curling, "it'll be kindling by tomorrow evening." Behind her, a few neighbors gathered at a cautious distance, whispering among themselves, their expressions a cocktail of pity and fear. Old Mr. Henley, who fished every morning by the dock, shifted uncomfortably, his cap pulled low, while a young couple clutching their toddler shook their heads but said nothing. Marcus caught their eyes, silently pleading for anyone to speak up, but the crowd stayed hushed, subdued by the iron grip of the HOA's intimidation. Karen clicked her pen, jotting a note on her clipboard as if marking his resistance. Down for sport, and Marcus felt his chest burn with helpless rage, his voice rising. "You can't just take my home because you feel like it. This place is my family's legacy. My father built this cabin with his bare hands, long before your little covenants were even dreamed up." The wind carried his words across the lake, the echo sharp against the still water, but Karen only tilted her head, faux sympathy dripping from her reply. "Legacy is lovely, Marcus, but unpaid fees are not. We'll see you comply one way or another." As she turned to leave, heels crunching decisively on gravel, Marcus's eyes flicked back to the notice. The words 24 hours to comply burned into his vision like a brand. He felt the weight of the neighbor's silence, the smug finality in Karen's voice, and the sting of injustice rooting deep in his chest. Disbelief had already bled into anger, but now that anger hardened into something sharper, determination. He crumpled the notice in his hand, the paper groaning as if echoing his fury, and muttered under his breath, "They picked the wrong man to push." The chapter closed with Karen's voice drifting back, sing-song and cruel. "Demolition starts at 10 a.m. Marcus, make your peace with it." The screen would fade to black here if this were film, leaving the image of Marcus standing on his porch, fists clenched, the lake shimmering behind him. Neighbors turning away in cowardice, the doomed cabin silhouetted against the sinking sun. And the words 24 hours remaining, etched like a countdown across the sky. The next morning dawned far too bright for the storm brewing in Marcus's chest, sunlight glinting across the lake in cruel contrast to the dread curling in his gut. And by the time he stepped onto his porch with a half-drunk mug of black coffee, the distant growl of diesel engines shattered the birdsong like an omen. Down the narrow gravel road, a convoy of yellow bulldozers, dump trucks, and utility vans rumbled forward, their hazard lights blinking. A bright orange demo crew sign slapped on the lead vehicle, and behind them came Karen Maddox in her polished SUV. Windows tinted so dark, Marcus could only see his own grim reflection in the glass as it rolled to a stop at the foot of his driveway. His grip tightened on the mug until the ceramic cracked, scalding coffee seeping between his fingers as he whispered to himself, "They're really going to do it." Within minutes, contractors in neon vests and hard hats swarmed across his property like ants, measuring, marking, and shouting instructions, their boots thudding against his porch as if his cabin were nothing more than lumber waiting to be reclaimed. "Stop!" Marcus's voice roared across the yard, carrying over the machinery, but the crew didn't even slow. One man with a clipboard glanced at him so flat, so indifferent, that Marcus felt invisible, like his ownership, his memories. His very existence here had been erased with the stroke of some HOA pen. Neighbors gathered along the edges of the property, some whispering with pity, others openly gawking as though demolition was entertainment. Old Henley stood wringing his cap in both hands, murmuring, "Damn shame, damn shame." At the same time, the young couple from yesterday clutched their child tighter, the woman biting her lip as though she wanted to speak up but couldn't risk Karen's wrath. Speaking of Karen, she emerged from her SUV like a queen arriving at court, her red blazer immaculate, oversized sunglasses hiding whatever flicker of humanity might have existed in her eyes. With theatrical precision, she raised her phone, filming the cabin from every angle as though eager to document her victory. "Marcus," she said sweetly, her voice just loud enough for the neighbors to hear, "you've had plenty of chances to resolve this. Non-compliance has consequences, and today you'll learn them firsthand." Marcus's fists balled, every muscle in his body straining against the urge to lunge at her, but the sight of two deputies clearly brought in at the HOA's request posted casually near the driveway reminded him that doing so would only hand her more satisfaction. "This is my home," he bellowed, his throat raw. "My father built this place with his bare hands. What gives you the right?" Karen tilted her head, a smirk curling her lips, and replied with mock pity, "What gives us the right? The rules you ignored, Marcus. You can scream about heritage all you like, but the board voted unanimously. Consider it democracy at work." The first strike came with a deafening crunch, the bulldozer's steel claw ramming into the porch railing, splintering wood into a rain of jagged shards that clattered across the lawn. And Marcus felt something inside him fracture with it, a surge of helpless rage so intense his vision blurred. He staggered forward, shouting, "Stop, you can't do this." But two workers in vests stepped in his path, shaking their heads with an almost apologetic firmness. Behind them, the machines roared louder, gears grinding as the walls of his cabin trembled under their assault. Windows shattered with crystalline screams. The beloved rocking chair his mother used to sit in toppled and splintered. The porch swing his niece adored wrenched off its chains and tossed aside like scrap metal. Marcus's breath came ragged, chest heaving as each blow tore not just at wood, but at memory family gatherings by the fireplace, fishing gear lying neatly against the wall, photographs of his father's calloused hands holding the very hammer that had built these beams. Now those beams cracked, fell, and were scooped into the maw of machines indifferent to history. The neighbors gasped as the roof caved inward, a cloud of dust mushrooming into the sky, coating Marcus's clothes in gray, stinging his eyes until tears mingled with grit. Somewhere in the haze, Karen's laughter rang sharp, like glass on metal, and it cut him deeper than any splinter. "See, neighbors," she announced smugly, gesturing toward the ruin. "This is what happens when people think they're above the rules. Order must be preserved, and sometimes it requires tough decisions." The words stabbed at Marcus, humiliation, pressing down heavier than the dust cloud, but even as his knees buckled, Fury surged anew. If Karen thought this was the end, she had no idea who she was dealing with. He turned his back on her, shoulders squared, pulling his phone from his pocket with hands that trembled not from fear, but from the weight of resolve. And he scrolled to a private family group chat, the one reserved for matters that truly mattered, the one labeled simply Unit. The rumble of machinery pounded in his ears as he pressed call, raising the phone to his lips, voice low but brimming with fire as his cabin collapsed behind him in a deafening roar of finality. When the line clicked open, he didn't waste words, didn't try to mask the fury boiling in his blood. He simply muttered, every syllable like a loaded round chambered and ready, "They picked the wrong man." That night, Marcus drove 3 towns over to his uncle's farmhouse, headlights slicing through the rural dark until the warm glow of kitchen windows broke the gloom. And as soon as he stepped inside, the familiar smell of roasted chicken, cornbread, and coffee wrapped around him like a blanket. But the comfort lasted only a heartbeat because the grief of what he had lost clung to him like ash, and his shoulders slumped as though he had carried the weight of the collapsed cabin all the way here. At the long oak table sat his family, his older brother Daniel with the square jaw and quiet intensity that always made strangers assume he was military, his sister Renee with eyes sharp as glass and a posture that radiated no-nonsense authority, and his uncle Frank at the head of the table, sleeves rolled up, gray hair trimmed to regulation neatness even in retirement. And when Marcus collapsed into a chair, silence settled heavy as lead until Daniel finally said, voice low and controlled, "We heard." Marcus's hands trembled as he tried to cut a piece of chicken, the knife slipping against the plate, and then the words tumbled out raw, jagged, unstoppable. How the HOA had posted the fraudulent notice, how Karen Maddox smirked while bulldozers clawed apart the cabin, how neighbors stood frozen between pity and cowardice, how he stood in the dust like a man stripped bare. For a long while, no one spoke, only the scrape of chairs as Renee leaned forward, elbows on the table, eyes narrowing with that calculated look Marcus had seen her use on suspects in an interrogation room. "And you said you never missed a single fee?" she pressed, voice cool. "Not one," Marcus snapped back, his own pride stiffening even under the humiliation. "I've got records, bank statements, everything. They invented it just to make an example of me." Uncle Frank exhaled, long and slow, the kind of sigh that carried decades of law enforcement experience, and he finally said, "That smells like fraud, coercion, maybe even racketeering if the board's been targeting multiple properties." Marcus blinked, confused, then frowned as realization began dawning. "Wait, you're saying?" That's when Daniel pushed back his chair, reached into his jacket, and with a deliberate calmness laid his FBI badge flat on the table, gold glint catching the overhead light. Renee followed, pulling a slim leather wallet from her purse and flicking it open to reveal a TF credentials, her lips curving into the faintest of knowing smiles as if she had been waiting for this moment to reveal the truth. Uncle Frank chuckled softly, a gravelly sound, and slid a folder across the table stamped with IRS Criminal Investigations, tapping the cover with a calloused finger. "Marcus," he said, his voice warm but edged with iron, "you didn't just lose a cabin today, you handed this family a reason to work together again." Marcus stared at them, shock cracking open into something fierce, something almost holy, pride. For years he had thought of himself as the odd one out, the quiet cabin man who fixed boats while the rest of the family chased criminals in cities he'd only seen on TV. But tonight, as badges gleamed under kitchen light, he felt the invisible thread that tied them tighter than blood, the thread of justice, of vengeance tempered by law. Dinner stretched on, the conversation shifting from the small talk of passing dishes to the clinical precision of an operation being born. Renee spoke about patterns of HOA boards colluding with developers. Daniel mapped out how subpoenas could trace the false accounting. Frank muttered about tax fraud angles that could cripple them financially, and Marcus sat at the center of it, grief burning into resolve, adding his own details of names, dates, whispered rumors from neighbors who had once been pressured but too afraid to speak. At one point, Daniel leaned forward, eyes locking on Marcus, and said, "They thought they were just harassing a homeowner. What they don't realize is they messed with the wrong family." The line struck Marcus like a spark to dry timber, igniting something deeper than anger, a cold storm swirling beneath his ribs, and in that moment, He wasn't just a victim mourning splintered walls and ashes. He was a man with a unit behind him, a family whose tools were subpoenas, warrants, undercover operations, and federal firepower. Around the table, the air grew charged, less like a dinner and more like a briefing room, the clatter of silverware replaced by clipped phrases, tactical outlines, the quiet rhythm of strategy weaving itself tighter with every exchange. Finally, as the plates sat empty and the coffee grew cold, Uncle Frank leaned back, folding his arms, his eyes sharp despite the years etched into his face. "So," he said, his tone the calm before a storm, "we agree the HOA crossed a line that makes this more than local pettiness. We treat it like organized crime because that's what it is." Daniel nodded once firm. Renee smirked with the anticipation of a predator who had scented blood, and Marcus felt his pulse steady, a calmness overtaking him not because the pain had faded, but because it had found purpose. The farmhouse clock ticked, loud in the silence. That followed, every second a drumbeat towards something inevitable, and finally Marcus pushed back from the table, stood tall, and looked each of them in the eye. "They destroyed my home," he said, his voice steady now, every word deliberate. "But together we're going to destroy their whole empire." The room was still, the air thick with conviction. Until Daniel lifted his glass of water in a silent toast, Renee followed, Frank joined, and Marcus mirrored them, 4 glasses clinking softly in the quiet kitchen. The storm was gathering, invisible, but unstoppable, and outside the farmhouse, the wind picked up across the fields as if nature itself had leaned in to listen, to bear witness. And as the final ember of grief burned into steel resolve, the unspoken truth shimmered in every glance around that table. The HOA had just declared war on the wrong family. The next morning, the farmhouse kitchen transformed from a place of comfort into a command center, laptops open, encrypted databases glowing across the table, and the quiet hum of printers spitting out documents like an unseen hand peeling away the HOA's mask, while Marcus watched in awe as his family slipped into their professional skins with terrifying ease. Daniel's FBI clearance pulled federal property lien records. Renee navigated ATF seizure databases, Uncle Frank tapped into IRS transaction alerts, and together their screens lit up with the kind of information no small-town board ever dreamed could be traced, Marcus contributing by digging through his own filing cabinets of receipts and photos of HOA notices, his heart pounding with a strange mix of curiosity and dread as every click, every page revealed new cracks in the facade. Names of contractors billed but never paid, inflated landscaping invoices, emergency maintenance charges on properties where no work had ever been done. And slowly a pattern emerged like a map etched in smoke. The HOA wasn't just petty. It was a racket, an organized machine built on extortion disguised as fees. Renee leaned back, biting her lip as she scrolled through one particularly damning set of PDFs. They're double billing residents for lake maintenance, charging the HOA fund, then again to individual cabins, and pocketing the difference. She muttered, disgust simmering in her voice. Daniel, cool as ever, tapped another screen showing scanned wire transfers, and it doesn't stop there. Look, $75,000 moved last year from the HOAS account to a shell company in Nevada. No services rendered, no receipts, just a black hole. Uncle Frank grunted, his eyes narrowing. Classic laundering. Shuffle the money through dummy cores until it disappears offshore. Marcus's pulse quickened as he realized the scale of what they were uncovering. It wasn't just his cabin. It was dozens of families bled dry, their fees transformed into slush funds, vacations, luxury cars, power trips, all signed off by smug board members like Karen Maddox. It was then that Marcus remembered the whispers he'd heard at the dock. A few months back, when his neighbor Tom, an aging veteran with more arthritis than strength, muttered that Karen had threatened to fine him for non-standard paint colors if he didn't shut up about rising fees. Marcus excused himself, dialed Tom, and within an hour the old man shuffled into the farmhouse, baseball cap in hand, his voice trembling but steady as he spilled what he'd seen. Board meetings where receipts were shredded before anyone else could review them, contracts awarded to friends who never showed up for work, Karen bragging after 2 glasses of wine that she had a bank account in the Caymans for retirement security. Renee's pen flew across her notepad. Daniel, recorded with his phone, and Frank smiled grimly as if the missing puzzle piece had just clicked into place. Marcus watched Tom's hands shake as he recounted how Karen had sent goons contractors on her payroll to intimidate him when he once asked too many questions. And something inside Marcus hardened, his grief now alloyed with a sharp edge of rage. This wasn't just corruption, this was predation. By dusk, the farmhouse table was buried under a war map of evidence. Flowcharts linking shell companies to Karen's personal account, sticky notes marking false invoices, timelines of intimidation cross-referenced, with bank withdrawals, and in the center a photo of Karen smiling in her prim red jacket at a summer HOA barbecue, surrounded by children and neighbors who had no idea the woman standing there was siphoning their money to an offshore paradise. Daniel pointed at the diagram, his voice clipped and professional. "We've got enough for probable cause. Fraud, money laundering, extortion. This isn't just an abuse of power, it's federal crime territory." Renee leaned forward, her smile sharp as glass. "And the best part? With the demolition, she gave us a motive and a pattern. We can tie financial fraud directly to criminal intimidation." Marcus felt a surge of empowerment for the first time since the bulldozers. He wasn't helpless. He was part of something larger, a storm gathering that Karen had no clue was already rolling toward her. Uncle Frank, arms crossed, nodded slowly. "But we'll need airtight proof. Offshore transfers leave trails, but if she's smart, she's using cutouts. We follow the wire, subpoena the banks, corner her where she thinks she's untouchable." The farmhouse grew quiet, the weight of the revelation settling like a storm cloud, and Marcus exhaled, the words coming out like a vow etched in steel. "So, it's true. She destroyed my cabin, my memories, just to cover up her empire. Well, let's burn hers to the ground." Outside the window, the lake shimmered in twilight, deceptively calm, while inside the farmhouse the family leaned over glowing screens and cluttered papers, eyes locked, shoulders squared, the quiet unity of hunters closing in on prey. And as Daniel refreshed one last banking report, a string of numbers flickered across the screen, a Cayman Islands routing code tied directly to Karen Maddox, the HOA president herself. The room fell into charged silence, the kind that prickles at the skin, until Renee whispered, her voice low but venomous, "She's funneling their money offshore." And in that moment, Marcus knew the game had shifted. The HOA thought they had buried him under rubble, but in truth, they had unearthed a storm that was about to consume them all. The town hall buzzed with restless energy that evening, folding chairs scraping against linoleum as neighbors shuffled in, whispering about rumors of fraud, fines, and the cabin demolition that still smelled faintly of charred wood along the lakefront. And in the middle of the room stood Karen Maddox, HOA president, dressed in her sharp red suit, chin tilted upward with that smug smile she wore like armor, clipboard clutched against her chest as if it were a shield. But when Marcus entered, through the double doors, silence rippled through the crowd like a stone dropped into still water. His calm, steady stride a stark contrast to the storm that had carried him here. Behind him, just inside the door, stood Daniel, Renee, and Uncle Frank, not saying a word, their plain jackets hiding sidearms and badges that caught the overhead lights when they shifted just right, their presence quiet but undeniable, a shadow of authority in a room used to Karen's unchecked power. Marcus took his seat at the long table facing the board, slid a thick manila folder across the surface, and leaned back, his voice even but laced with steel as he began. "I'm here tonight because you told me I owed money I didn't, because you destroyed my home without due process, and because you thought I was alone. Well, I'm not. And neither is anyone else in this neighborhood." Gasps whispered through the crowd, neighbors glancing at one another nervously, while Karen forced a brittle laugh and leaned forward, her manicured finger tapping the folder. "Oh, Marcus, please, we've heard this song before if you had just paid your fees. None of this would have happened, and bringing your family here doesn't change the fact you broke the rules." Marcus smiled faintly, opened the folder, and began pulling out document after document, spreading them like cards on a table for everyone to see. Copies of double-billed maintenance, invoices, records of shell companies tied to HOA funds, bank statements routing thousands offshore. "These aren't my words," Marcus said, his voice rising just enough to echo. "These are your signatures, your transfers, your theft from Every family in this neighborhood. This isn't about paint colors or lawn length, it's about fraud, laundering, and extortion. A heavy silence fell, broken only by the rustle of papers as neighbors leaned forward to read, jaws tightening, eyes narrowing with anger that until now had been fear. Karen's mask slipped for just a second, her lips tightening before she laughed. Again, louder, brittle as glass. This is ridiculous fabrications, misunderstandings. Do you really think anyone will believe you over me? I run this board. I've kept this community safe, clean, valuable. And you, she sneered, eyes narrowing at Marcus, you're just a man whose shack got torn down because you refused to follow the rules. Pathetic. The board members beside her shifted uneasily, sweat beating at their temples, one clearing. His throat as if he wanted to speak but thought better of it under her glare, while neighbors began to murmur louder, some standing, pointing at invoices that bore their own addresses, their voices shaking with realization that they too had been robbed. Marcus stood now, tall and unflinching, his voice steady as a drumbeat. You've stolen from every person here. You've lined your pockets while hiding behind rules and fines, and you thought no one could touch you. But you made one mistake, Karen, you picked the wrong man. At the back of the room, Daniel stepped forward, his FBI badge catching the light, the gold glint silencing the room in an instant, and he spoke with a voice that brooked no denial. Actually, Karen, you picked the wrong family. The words hit like a hammer, neighbors gasping, board members paling, and Karen's laugh broke into a shrill, nervous bark. Oh, please, you think a little badge will scare me? This is a neighborhood dispute, not a crime scene. But then Renee pulled a folder from her bag, slapped it onto the table, and flipped it open to reveal signed federal warrants with Karen's name bold at the top, while Uncle Frank stepped up beside her, his IRS credentials visible, his gravelly voice cutting through the tension like a blade. Fraud, money laundering, racketeering, and tax evasion. That's not a dispute. That's a case. And you're the target. The boardroom erupted into chaos, neighbors shouting in outrage, some standing on chairs to see the documents, others yelling at board members who now sat pale and sweating, Karen's bravado collapsing into frantic denial as she clutched her clipboard like a lifeline. You can't do this, you don't understand, I was protecting this neighborhood. But Daniel didn't flinch, stepping closer, his eyes locked on hers as he slowly unfolded the warrant and held it high for all to see. His words heavy with finality. Karen Maddox, HOA President, you are under federal investigation. Room froze in stunned silence, the weight of the moment pressing into every corner, and Marcus stood at the center of it, calm, steady. The man who had lost his cabin but found his power. The man who had been underestimated until the very end. And as Karen's laughter broke into silence, her hands trembling, the neighbors watched the empire she had built crumble before their eyes. And then Daniel laid the warrant flat on the table with a sharp snap, his voice quiet but lethal. This isn't over tonight, Karen. This is just the beginning. The next morning dawned unusually bright, sunlight spilling over the lake as if the world itself knew justice was about to bloom. And Marcus stood at the edge of the cul-de-sac with his arms folded, watching as a convoy of black SUVs rolled into the neighborhood, federal decals gleaming in the light, their doors swinging open in perfect choreography as FBI, ATF, and IRS agents in tactical jackets fanned out toward the HOA office like a tide of authority reclaiming stolen ground. Neighbors rushing out of their homes in bathrobes and slippers, murmurs turning into cheers when they realized the empire that had ruled them with iron fists and endless fines was about to fall. Inside the HOA headquarters, a pretentious two-story office with marble floors and framed community pride posters, Karen and her board sat huddled around their long oak table, nervously sipping coffee, pretending everything was business as usual, until the front doors burst open and agents flooded in, voices booming. Federal agents. Everyone step away from the table. Papers fluttered like panicked birds as board members scrambled, one dropping his mug, another trying to slam shut a laptop only for an agent to yank it away. The screen still glowing with wire transfers. Offshore, and Karen shot to her feet, face flushed red, shouting, "You can't do this. This is private property." But her words bounced off the Kevlar vests and mirrored sunglasses of people who had heard it all before. Marcus walked in last, his steps unhurried, his expression carved from stone, while his family spread out like a silent phalanx, Daniel overseeing. Agents cataloging files into boxes, Renee directing techs who unplugged servers, Frank grilling a trembling treasurer about hidden accounts, each move efficient, unstoppable. Neighbors pressed against the office windows, phones recording, gasps rising each time another banker's box of evidence was marched out under seal, and cheers exploding when a handcuffed board member was led past the glass, shame etched across his face. "You don't understand," one cried, voice breaking as agents read him his rights. "Karen made us." Another stammered through tears. "We thought this was just fees, not," before an IRS agent cut him off with a firm shove toward the waiting van. The taste of vindication was sweet in the air, bitter only for those who had ruled with cruelty. And Marcus felt his chest loosen as if the cabin rubble that had weighed on him for weeks had finally lifted. But Karen wasn't done. Not yet. She slammed her palms against the table, knocking over her coffee in a spreading stain, and screamed, "You think this means anything? I'll sue every one of you. You'll beg me to come back when your property values crash." Her voice cracked, but the agents didn't flinch. Two stepped forward, cuffs glinting, and Marcus's eyes never left hers as he spoke, voice low but carrying through the chaos. "Karen, property values don't mean a thing when the whole neighborhood's been living in fear. Today, that ends." She lunged as if to claw at him, but an agent seized her arms, twisting them behind her with practiced efficiency, the click of handcuffs punctuating the moment like the slam of a gavel. Neighbors outside erupted into cheers, some crying, others chanting Marcus's name, and phones caught the exact second Corinne Maddox, the tyrant of their lives, was dragged from the building shrieking like a banshee, her hair disheveled, her heels clattering against the floor as she screamed over her shoulder, "This isn't over, Marcus. You hear me? I'll burn you for this." The agents forced her through the doors, her voice carrying down the street until it was drowned by applause and the sound of camera shutters. For Marcus, it was more than revenge. It was justice carved clean and undeniable, a promise to his late father that their family name would never bow. A victory not just for himself, but for every neighbor who had lived under Karen's shadow. And as he watched the convoy doors slam shut, engines roaring, and the caravan roll away with a arrested board, he knew this was a turning point. Yet as the crowd pressed in around him, neighbors clapping his back, one old man gripping his hand with tears in his eyes saying, "You saved us," Marcus felt a chill under the warmth. The storm wasn't over, not yet, because Corinne's threats had not been empty screams, but the kind of venom that lingered, promising future strikes from the shadows. And as he looked out over the lake where his cabin once stood, rubble still piled on the shoreline, he muttered just for himself, "She thinks this is the end. But it's only the fallout." The lake shimmered under the late afternoon sun, its surface glittering like a sheet of diamonds as Marcus stood on the patch of cleared ground where his cabin had once stood proud. The rubble finally hauled away, the scars on the earth waiting to be healed, and in his hand he held a hammer, its weight both comforting and symbolic, as if every swing would drive a nail not just into wood but into a new chapter of his life. Around him gathered neighbors who only weeks ago had watched silently as bulldozers crushed his home, some lowering their eyes in shame, others stepping forward awkwardly with boards, paint cans, and toolboxes, each apology written across their faces before the words even left their lips. "Marcus," one older woman whispered, pressing a bag of nails into his palm, "I should have spoken up sooner. I'm sorry." Another neighbor added as he set a beam onto the sawhorses, "We're scared of Karen, but that's no excuse. Let us help fix what they took." Marcus nodded, his anger no longer a raging fire but a steady ember, and together they lifted the first frame of what would soon be a stronger, prouder cabin, the sound of hammers and saws blending with the cries of seagulls and the rhythmic splash of the water against the shore. Children carried scraps of wood, women painted planks, men dug post holes, and for the first time, the community moved not under the weight of fear, but in the lightness of unity, every gesture a silent vow that the tyranny of the HOA would never return. As the skeletal shape of the new cabin began to rise, Marcus paused at the shoreline, looking out across the lake where the reflection of the sun painted a golden path, and he thought of his family, their badges, their power, their protection, and hand. Realized that what mattered most wasn't their authority, but the strength of people standing together when it counted. He breathed deeply, taking in the scent of fresh-cut lumber and lake air, then returned to the site, lifting the first broad plank into place, raising his hammer high as the crowd grew quiet, watching as if this single act sealed the promise of their new beginning. With one deliberate strike, the nail drove home, and Marcus muttered under his breath, words meant only for himself but loud enough to echo in his heart, "This time, no one touches my home." As the sun dipped lower over the lake, painting the water in molten gold and amber streaks, the camera panned slowly over Marcus's rebuilt cabin, each plank perfectly aligned, every window glinting with new life, while neighbors strolled along. The shore, children laughing, dogs chasing sticks, and flowers freshly planted along the paths whispered of renewal, a gentle breeze carrying the scent of pine and lake water. A voice Marcus's narrated over the montage, calm yet firm, "Never let power be abused. Property is more than land, it's a legacy. It's the sweat of your hands, the love of your family, and the respect of your community. It's where memories are made, and where justice, once denied, can finally bloom." Scenes cut to Karen, being escorted into a federal vehicle, her screams fading behind tinted windows, juxtaposed with close-ups of neighbors helping each other, carrying tools, painting fences, sharing laughter, and Marcus inspecting the new cabin's foundation, running his hands over smooth wood beams, nodding in quiet satisfaction. The narration continued, layering over shots of children launching small toy boats, elders tending flower beds, and the lake reflecting the twilight sky like a canvas of hope. When people stand together, when truth is brought to light, even the most brazen attempts at oppression crumble. One person alone may be challenged, but a community united, armed with courage and conscience, is unbreakable. Never underestimate the power of those who know their worth, and never forget that standing up for what's right can inspire generations to come. The montage slowed, lingering on Marcus hammering a final nail, a soft smile tugging at his lips as the camera drew in close on his eyes steady, unwavering, full of the quiet pride of a man who reclaimed not just his home but his dignity. A final cut showed the lake at dusk, golden reflections fading into soft purples and blues, neighbors waving from a distance, children running past with laughter echoing across the water, and Marcus's voice concluded with a low, confident refrain. "They thought they could break me. They forgot who stands with me." The screen held for a beat on Marcus's silhouette against the fading light. The cabin restored, the community stronger than ever, and a sense of closure and subtle warning lingered in the air, leaving viewers with inspiration, hope, and the undeniable message that justice, once pursued with patience and courage, can always be reclaimed.